And welcome to our fourth and final plenary session, Next Steps for a European Framework for Science Diplomacy. And I'm very pleased to invite the moderator, and she is none other than the former Chief Scientific Advisor to the President of the European Commission and current President of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, Professor Dame Anne Glover. So please take the floor. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome to this last plenary session here this afternoon. So welcome to all of you in the room and welcome also to our participants online. It's good to have you here and you will be able to ask questions through Slido, which will be coming up during our session here. So we've got a really interesting panel for you. We've got a very short period of time, so I just wanted to let you know how the panel will run. No big surprises, so each of our participants, and you can see everybody here, will give a short intervention, just 3 minutes or so, to talk about some specific issues for them. And this is really all about the next steps for this framework, European Framework for Science Diplomacy. And if you were here for the last talk, Jeremy Farrar's talk, then he said that we all have a responsibility. So you'll hear the views of the panel, but frankly, it's not all up to the panel. They will have some important contributions to make, but it's for you online and it's for you in the room to say what you think would be powerful and important to get that next framework right. And in my view, there's a lot riding on it. We need to get this right. It's a contribution we can make, and we all have a responsibility to do that. So, without saying too much more, we will have the interventions 3 minutes each. We've got a disruptive voice, which is always good because we can't make the best decisions or come up with the best proposals without challenge and disruption. So we will have our disruptive voice and then maybe some response from the panel to that. And then I'm going to throw the floor open to you for your questions. I'll take questions from the room as well as online, and you know the score by now. They will come up on Slido, so you can see the questions there. So then, without any further comment from me, I want to introduce our first speaker, Jan Marco Müller, who I knew well because he and I worked together at the European Commission for 3 years. And Jan Marco is embedded in science diplomacy. So 10 years ago, when it was just a kind of baby at the European Commission, Jan Marco has taken this and nurtured it. And so the question that I would like Jan Marco to start off with is really to find out, Jan Marco, how you will develop this framework, and also what impact do you hope the framework will have? And you have 3 minutes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anne. I hope this microphone works. Yes, it does, okay. Let us first perhaps remind ourselves, why are we doing this? And let me remind you, in 2012, the European Union received the Nobel Peace Prize. Not just for the legacy of having preserved peace in Europe over decades, but also, of course, with the idea to push the European Union to foster peace and multilateralism also in the future. And that's ultimately also what science diplomacy is about. Yes, it is also about competitiveness and a lot of other things we've heard at the conference, but at the end of the day, this is, of course, a very core task of science diplomacy. And given all this geopolitical situation as it is, member states asked us to develop a European framework for science diplomacy. And I was the poor guy asked to coordinate this. And the issue is, when you try to bring scientists and diplomats in Europe together, you're faced with a number of challenges. Starting with the fact that scientists and the diplomats wouldn't even agree on what Europe is. European research area here, common foreign security policy there. obviously, the institutional architecture of the European Union doesn't make it easy, because here, foreign and security policy, national sovereign policy, research and innovation policy is different. We have all these players, the science ministries, the foreign ministries, all the academic community, of course. We have differences in languages, the technical jargon we speak in science and in diplomacy. Actually, the multilingualism in Europe that comes into play. So many issues. So for me, it was very clear from the outset, the only way to do this is, first of all, bottom up, to create the buy-in on both sides. It must be inclusive. Everybody needs to be involved, state, non-state actors. And of course, also, it needs to be informal. Because once you go through formal routes, you will hit a lot of roadblocks. So what we did is actually we issued an open call. We said everybody who wants to contribute can apply. In a matter of 3 weeks, we had 600 applications. And we selected 130 experts for 5 working groups to develop together recommendations for European Framework for Science Diplomacy in a bottom-up inclusive process. The trick was that in the working groups we said 50-50 science and diplomacy, and the scientist and the diplomat as a co-chair. So that is really co-owned by the 2 communities in a bottom-up fashion. And then we put the communities together. And that's where the interesting part was really happening. When you close them into one room and tell them, please talk to each other, understand each other, develop recommendations together. And these were fascinating discussions. I was really tempted to get my popcorn out while watching scientists and diplomats discussing the concept of like-mindedness and who is like-minded and who is not. And at the end of the day, the result was this big report, which you certainly will have seen, published in February about the European Framework for Science Diplomacy, 100 pages, very pragmatic, very direct, very concrete actions on what to do. And now, of course, the challenge is to develop this into some sort of a policy document. That's what is happening right now. The Commissioner announced it at the beginning of the conference, a Council recommendation on Framework for Science Diplomacy, which we hope the Commission will be adopting in February as a proposal, and then it goes to the Member States, and they will discuss it and ultimately adopt it as a Council recommendation, because it needs to be owned by the Member States and by the Council. And yeah, in terms of the impact, I mean, for me, actually, it's not so important, this report which we've done, or this Council recommendation which we've done, or which we are going to do. It is actually the process itself where the magic happens, where the magic of science diplomacy happens when you really get the scientists and the diplomats together. And I think what we see here, actually, in the audience, is the result of this years-long process by many different players of bringing these communities together and creating really a science diplomacy community in Europe, which can push it forward.
Jan, thank you very much. So now let's go on to the next interventions. And the question that you're all answering here is, what is the European Framework for Science Diplomacy? Why is it important for your organizations? And how will it help in achieving your goals? So first of all, I'm going to come to Alessandro Lombardo, so chair of the EU Science Diplomacy Alliance. So how are you going to answer that question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation, of course. For us, looking at the European Framework for Science Diplomacy from the perspective of the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance, this is really an important step forward. It's a guidance, it's a policy reference that we do need in order to progress in our work. Now, the Science Diplomacy Alliance, probably some of you are already familiar with this network, which is actually the largest network of science diplomacy in Europe. It was launched in 2021 as a result of 3 Horizon 2020 projects. The 3 partnerships of these projects merged together, and this network was established. And let me also take this occasion to highlight the support that the Alliance is still receiving from the European Commission. An Alliance Secretariat is supporting the work of this network in terms of organizations, in terms of dissemination of the activities that we are performing. But at the same time, I wish to highlight the fact that the alliance has been growing steadily over the last 4 years. Yesterday we held here as a side event our General Assembly. 10 new partners were included in our network. And let me highlight now that the network has more than 60 partners, which some based in the EU, some in other countries. Altogether, these are 24 countries represented within the alliance. And this is a huge network that is expanding. We keep on receiving expressions of interest, of course, also during this conference. These 2 days we are receiving several requests to know something more about the alliance and how to enter this network. And it's a huge network, I would say also a very important network in terms of the capacity to mobilize expertise across various fields of science diplomacy. Jan-Marco Müller mentioned the 130 experts that participated in the elaboration of the expert report, a European Framework for Science Diplomacy. Now 16 out of these 130 are members of the alliance. Again, also during this conference we have supported some of the parallel sessions coordinated by our members, those on the Global Commons, but also let me highlight the parallel session on non-state actors, which was coordinated by our member MCAA, Marie Curie Alumni Association. So it's quite a broad network of institutions expanding. Now we're trying also to cover some countries that are not yet represented within our network. And so while expanding, of course, we need and we will need better and stronger internal structures, but also very clear policy guidance. And this is what we are going to find in the European Framework for Science Diplomacy. Thank you.
Alessandro, thank you very much. And now I want to pass on to Andrei Luca, who's the chair of the EU network of science advisors. Sounds like a bit like herding cats, but anyway, that's just my personal experience. And science diplomacy coordinators. So, Andrei, what do you think?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. As Jan-Marco was saying, process is important. At the same time, it has created momentum for member states to galvanize actors in diplomacy, in science, but not only, in fundraising, in public policy, to come together and work for putting science diplomacy to the benefit of Europe and of the member states. That is certainly the purpose of this endeavor. And it has happened not only in one member state, but it has happened in several. And from my own experience, I would want to point out that it helps if the other interlocutors in this national discussion have been or are members of various European structures or global structures related to science diplomacy, and the EU Science Diplomacy Alliance comes to mind as a very relevant organization structure in that respect, because they are connected to the debate, they are at the same time understanding the stakes, and they can think somehow outside the national lines and in European terms or in wider global terms. Regionally, we feel that we can also contribute to the debate, to the European debate and to the development of the framework through the fact that we have in Southeast Europe, we have a certain specificity related to a sensitivity towards the issue of ethics and of equity in what regards technological distribution of technology and transfers, and not only, of course. At the same time, for historic and current reasons, we are very much pragmatically related to this kind of problematic, and therefore have found purpose in working together, being also mobilized through various instruments, including through UNESCO's Global Dialogue, for doing that. So we feel we can contribute to that, and it is no surprise that our message is one that European science diplomacy should translate innovation into values and remain anchored in social purpose. This is we realize this is not an easy thing to do, especially nowadays when science diplomacy is shifting towards a more transactionist approach. But we feel that the document at hand, the report we have released in February, does a very good job in arbitrating between the different objectives of European science diplomacy, and it's certainly a good starting point for our action forward. Thank you.
Andrei, thank you. So now I'd like to move on to Izaskun Lacunza, so the Director General of the Science and Technology Foundation in Spain. So how will the European Framework for Science Diplomacy help your organization?
Thank you. And before replying, let me just say, I think our Secretary General mentioned already, but we are putting together a number of science advice mechanisms in Spain. And I just wanted to say that we admire you very much. And Gianmarco, you were the pioneers in Europe, and you are a role model for us. And regarding the framework, the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology, we try to promote the public value of science. And it's under this framework, this umbrella in which science diplomacy is so important for us. We've been working for 10 years already, hand in hand with Gianmarco as well, in the idea of building together a European science diplomacy strategy somehow. Why is important for us, or for not only for my organization, but for the country itself? The first one is a practical answer, probably. It's always good to have a third-party validation. The science diplomacy community in Spain is very active, and we are believers, and it's always good to have a third-party validation saying to prove you right, and having this framework for us is very useful when we talk to our authorities and so on. And also it's a framework in which we look at our own strategy. We do have a science diplomacy strategy in the country, and it's very good to see and to somehow match our own instruments against the framework to prove that we are on the right path. And the other reason would be political, I would say. No matter what of the aspects that we've been discussing these 2 days here, from economic security, internal security, strategic autonomy, global challenges, if there is any chance that the European Union can somehow have a say there, it has to be together. There's no way that a single member state can achieve its own goals alone. And that's why we are so happy to see that there is a European Union framework, science diplomacy framework. And I can also say why it's very important for me. I am super proud of this framework. It's not that I have contributed alone, a lot. I'm talking as a European now, and I'm super happy that given the circumstances and the geopolitical situation, we as Europeans are putting together a framework that says, I'm going to read, that European science diplomacy should be maximizing the deployment of European research and innovation potential for the pursuit of peace and multilateralism, and reinforce Europe's commitment to managing global common goods and common sustainability and achievement of the global challenges. I think we should all be proud to have been able to put together this framework.
Thank you, Izaskun. So then our final contribution is from Martina Hartl, who's the Deputy Head of the Department of International Cooperation and Science Diplomacy in the Federal Ministry of Women, Science and Research in Austria. So, Martina.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'll make three very short points. The first one is, I think the impact has not only started with the report, it has actually started much earlier already with the working groups and trying to engage also Austrian researchers and Austrian diplomacy fellows into this group. So, and a very practical impact was also that our unit in the department is now the Department for International Cooperation and Science Diplomacy, which is now really also a sign that we take this issue very seriously also in our ministry. And together with the Foreign Ministry, and this is my second point, we are also trying to actively work, as you do in Spain, on creating an Austrian science diplomacy community that tries to get all the actors together. We're working on that, it's work in progress, but we had in November our first Austrian Science Diplomacy Roundtable, and I think we can be proud that we are achieving that. And for a small member state, I think such a framework could actually give good guidance. I think it could give a hook also then to say, well, we need to actually get our act together in Austria as well, and it's always good to have guidance coming also then from an EU level that gives us a little more leverage. But, and I think that's also an important point, and we see that also with the research security recommendations, we need some kind of flexibility and in implementing those things in our different countries, given the different situations of the R&I community and of the diplomatic community. So we need some flexibility in implementation. And also, I think one important point is also the link between science diplomacy and science for policy. And I think this is something where we and Spain also we work together on a international project at the moment at EU level to get also this scientific evidence into policy making and into foreign policy making in a better way.
Martina, thank you very much. So I think what we've heard here is fairly much uniform enthusiasm and excitement and support for this framework. And we've heard different reasons why it's valuable to organizations or to different member states. So now what I would like to do, but just before that, just to remind you about Slido, you can see that on the screen now. So whilst we're going to listen to the disruptive voice, here's a question for all of you, and that is, just pick one word and say what aspect you want to see covered by a future European framework for science diplomacy. So you have to pick one word, and whilst we're listening to our disruptive intervention, that will be assembled into a word cloud, which you will see at the end. There's nothing like building up suspense. So whilst that's happening, can I now introduce Tim Flink? So Tim is from the German Association of Research-Based Pharmaceutical Companies, but also has at Humboldt University been involved in research around developing the Handbook of Science Diplomacy. So it's an area he knows well. So Tim, can I invite you up here to be disruptive?
For having me. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was tempted to say, you know, if you're talking about vegetarian food, don't invite the butcher to the table, but I won't do this kind of disruption. When I heard your interventions, I felt pride in the actual trajectory of the science diplomacy discourse. The first project being started in 2008 in my career, then EU projects followed, and what a great crowd have we actually gathered over the last years. And on the other hand, as some of you know from my writing, I always want to stay, outside that discourse, in as much as it's complicated, to reflect on what's going on. When we look at the heuristics that have been developed over the last years, so everybody knows the Royal Society's AAAS is one, or our own one, X is influence and promotion. I was wondering if we are not critical enough about what we are actually creating. Because I still see, and also reflected in some of the panels and discussions that we heard, three major problems or maybe questions. Are we still sugarcoating reality and hyping a concept? So whenever you read about scientific literature on science diplomacy, it's always science diplomacy should. Science diplomacy is great because it can solve this and that. And it somehow, reverberates as a magic word that solves, as a panacea, everything. The second problem is inequality behind the rhetoric. So we had different panels about the polar, the Arctic, the oceans, about global south. And I was wondering if the science diplomacy community loves to talk about global partnerships, but too often hides old power games in this new language. So wealthy countries and increasingly corporate tech giants set the agenda, they own the infrastructures, and they collect the benefits, while weaker actors are expected to provide access, data, and goodwill. Under the banner of universal science, local knowledge is very often still sidelined, and structural inequalities within science. So we're talking about reputation games, about misconduct, about questions of, having adequate education and career perspectives for women. All of these aspects are somehow neglected whenever we talk about, the positive powers of science in diplomacy. So what about the intra dimensions, the social dimensions of the science system that are not okay? Should this discourse actually inherit and incorporate these questions and challenges in its discourse, or should it actually still talk about universal science, as an aspiration? Problem number 3, is science a soft power tool? When science diplomacy is regarded as just another instrument of soft power, scientists might be endangered, to be turned into quiet diplomats serving strategic and particularistic interests rather than global public goods. And this is where, the new heuristics, the framework, for example, comes into play. So as Jan Marco mentioned in Vienna, it's quite conspicuous to see that the new AAAS Royal Society's heuristic is cutting off one dimension, while we in the European context, because I was part in the developing of this framework, added one. And that's quite interesting to see. So to a certain extent, I was asking whether the new report of the Royal Society and the AAAS represents actually a community's candid admission of having in good faith sustained an illusion for 15 years long, now starkly confronted by a harsh and unforgiving reality, while our framework is trying to sensitize scientists, to be diplomatic, to act tactfully, because the intra-scientific relations that we have, in peer reviewing, in setting agendas together, they can be politicized very, very quickly. And this is why this framework actually is sensitizing us to be more sensitive in a world that is, far off the global euphoria of international research collaborations that we experienced within the millennial years. Concrete questions to you. How do we go about the framework? will it become part of the EU framework program in research and development? Will it inform, conditions of access and collaboration, the so-called Beteiligungsregeln? What is it called, Jan? What's going on with the diplomats? So we've seen yesterday, there's been a survey. Where were the foreign policy people? So the question is, do we as international science policy have found a concept where we can gather very often, but we're actually missing people who are working in the foreign offices. So these are a couple of thoughts to chew on and to work with. Thank you very much for having me again.
Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, so now we have some provocation for you. But before and I'm going to come and I'll ask you a few of those questions and frame them back to you. But I wonder if we can now look at the word cloud to see what you have come up with. Okay, then, so interestingly, and Tim brought this up, equity, right in the middle, innovation, security, equality, equity again, trust, badger, that's an interesting one, but okay, I'll need to think about that before framing it back to you. Openness, though, training, very interesting, because I think we feel sometimes that we can all just, science diplomacy, I can do that. I'm a scientist, I'm a diplomat. I think it's a bit more sophisticated than that. Okay, so as we look at these different words that you have contributed, and thank you, all of you online and here for doing that. Can I reframe some of Tim's questions back to you as the panel? And Jan, I'm going to come to you first. And so apologies to Tim if I'm not framing this exactly as you said it, but do you think there's a possibility that we might be overreaching what science diplomacy can do? So we are, as I've already said, we're incredibly enthusiastic about it. But are we realistic about what we can do with it?
The answer I would give to this is, in the past, when often we had science diplomacy discussions 10 years ago, there were mostly scientists in the room. And then we had the sugarcoating effect and the overselling effect and all the great things science can do for peace in the world, etc. But once you get the diplomats in the room, the career diplomats, then they will tell you, yeah, but the reality in the world out there looks different. It's a harsh reality. It's a hostile environment in which we as diplomats are operating. And that's a kind of a sense of realism that we get into the debate once you have an honest debate between scientists and diplomats. And I think that's exactly what we wanted to achieve with the bit of process which we have set in motion. Now, one thing I also want to say here is, you mentioned these 4 dimensions and the soft power versus hard power aspects. And I think part of it is also that we need to recognize the world does not look like we would like it to be. And science diplomacy is not about being nice to each other. Science diplomacy, diplomats will always tell you, okay, how can I use this? How is this useful to me? And member states or countries in general, they will always see, okay, what's the benefit I can have by using science diplomacy? So it is about, of course, diplomatic interests. And diplomatic interests are not always nice, so to speak. So when we exclude Russia from the Horizon Europe program, that is science diplomacy as well, because science is being used for an overarching foreign policy goal, and we can discuss all around this. But I think this sense of realism and reality of the geopolitical situation out there, that's what we get. That's the true value, actually, when you really get an honest debate between scientists and diplomats. And that's actually what we want to achieve. And also, when we draft the Council recommendations, it will be reflected in a way that there are, of course, strategic interests, which we have as the European Union, which can be economic interests, commercial interests, interests of defending academic freedom or other values. But of course, also interests that are in a global interest. The Sustainable Development Goals, and exactly this equity aspect that came up here.
Okay. But so I want to pick up more on that soft power issue that Tim challenged you with. And Martina, I'm going to come to you on this, because is there a problem, and Izaskun, you also might want to comment, but is there a problem here where you pull scientists into an environment and potentially could be asking them to liaise with diplomats and so on to provide something that the diplomats will find useful? And it could end up with scientists losing credibility. And there would be an enormous problem here, because if you look at international questionnaires, if you like, on trust, so every year there's a veracity index which is published by Ipsos Mori. And scientists come up routinely right at the top. Politicians, and I don't know if diplomats would exactly fit in there, but politicians are pretty much right at the bottom. So what do you do to protect the value of scientists getting involved in this science diplomacy area, but potentially to generate soft power, but to retain the credibility of the science?
I think that's a very good question, and I think it's also one that is really important as a policymaker to be credible against your scientific community. And I think the first one is we have to protect academic freedom. I think it's really important that we don't influence, as policymakers, the science per se. So I think we should not expect to get the answers we want from science, but we should expect to get the answers that they are finding, even if we're not happy with them. And I think this is one really important element, that they are free to do the research they want to do and do them also autonomously. So I think that is one important thing. The other thing is also if you take researchers and you want them to help, like in the pandemic, I think it's really important that you clarify their roles. I think there is a difference, and this always has to be reminded. They help us in finding decisions, but you can't blame the decisions on them. And I think that's really important, to clarify their role and not expose them. For example, I find it really very hurtful that these people were then attacked by the public for what they have tried to do and in trying to help us and trying to help also policy to find very short-term solutions for very immediate questions. So I think we have to also protect them if we give them the role of advising for policy. I think this is our duty as to protect them. So this would be my very short answer.
Thank you. And so I'm just following on from that, Izaskun. So you have a large budget and you fund research. So what would you be doing in order to support those researchers to be able to deliver into this agenda of science diplomacy?
Thank you. And before replying to that, may I say something about what Tim was saying, because it resonated me very much. He was wondering whether we were even coding science itself, because all of us are talking about science as being open and collaborative and for the common goods and so on. But I think that we need to be open as well of science having a dark side. I mean, it's fierce competition that sometimes force people to cheat. There is power mechanisms that facilitate somehow abuses in PhDs. There's still a lot to do when it comes to women participating in science fully. And I think that this needs to be said as well, because sometimes we talk about science as if it was almost a religion, and it's not. I mean, it's made by humans, and there's many things that need to be changed. And I think we have to be honest about that. Still, I think there is a case for science and knowledge to complement or somehow enrich the diplomatic relations and the multilateralism, for sure. But I think that needs to be said and acknowledged, and also explain that there are many science policy measures that many institutions are putting in place, the European Union in particular, to address that problems that science has. And also regarding your question about what we do and so on, it's also very clear for us, and we use the same example as you put, of the research community being very trusted by society. The surveys in Spain are super clear. I think it's doctors and researchers.
Yeah.
And on the other end, politicians for sure. And we also wonder, we are fostering this marriage, what's going to happen, right? Because, I mean, the moment that you get close to politicians, we've seen it in COVID, many times science has been used as a proxy to justify political decisions. I mean, it's a tricky situation. What is our bet? Our bet is to professionalize that interface. It's not, the way we see it, it's not a matter of the whole research community all of a sudden becoming advisors to the diplomats or the ministries or anything like that. On the contrary, what we are trying to foster is professionalized science advice and science diplomacy. In a way, getting to know these brokers of knowledge that, facilitate this conversation. And other things can be done as well. Asking your question, Anne, about what we could do. What we are doing is putting together some pilot calls with no big money, but to test whether it works or not, in which we are trying to promote research projects co-created with the public sector. So it's not so much about the researcher advising the public sector, but both of them understanding better what the research problem is under the public policy framework. And it's working quite well. We are in the process of funding the first projects now in the country. As I say, it's no big money, but it's also a message to the research community and the public sector, fostering an open dialogue, a collaboration among them. That's what we are trying to do.
Thank you very much. And before I come to you, I just want Alessandro and Andrei to address the provocation around equality. So is there an issue about, so if we address a science diplomacy network in the EU, are some people advantaged by that? Are some people disadvantaged by that? I'd be keen to hear your views.
Equity, as I said, is a main concern. The world today is, and the science diplomacy world that the world that science diplomacy is dealing with is certainly an expression of inequality, in the sense that a lot of resources are put in the hands of very few. A lot of science is done in the interests of very few. The actors that concentrate knowledge and can then spread it are very limited. So what we have to do is obviously to expand and to diversify. That is not act in isolation and in fragmentation, but what we have to do is have alternatives to what the current mindset is offering. Then, if I can pick on the line of Izaskun about science being a religion, science is definitely no religion, as the cardinal has quite clearly stated. Science and religion are complementary. And about Tim comment about diplomats and scientists, I wouldn't worry too much about scientists turning into quiet diplomats. As through our interaction, I have seen that this is not a real danger. What I would certainly do is bring more diplomats to the table, and as this conference is also an example of this, only 7% of people here have come from a diplomatic background, which is better than fewer than we had before. But of course, first of all, it they bring a certain perspective that is useful to the debate, but at the same time, they have to be here because they are permeable to others' opinion, to the opinion of scientists. Scientists have to convince diplomats because they have a point in militating for open science and for inclusiveness in scientific activity. So and diplomats have to be convinced about these imperatives.
Okay, thank you. And Alessandro, if you have something to add, but I would like you to look at also that first Slido question, which is how can non-EU member states contribute to the success of the European science diplomacy framework? Because it may have an equality aspect to it.
Well, that non-EU member states expression can be read in different ways. I will read it from my perspective, being an employee of an organization that has member states in the Western Balkans and in Eastern Europe. So for me, the non-EU member states are now the EU accession countries. And I think that also in terms of equity, or trying to achieve more equity in science diplomacy, one of the objectives we are trying also to pursue within the alliance is to bring the debate on science diplomacy in those areas, in those countries, in the Western Balkans, in Eastern Europe, particularly because that's the focus of my organization. At the same time, we are bringing the debate there, but we are trying also to bring their stakeholders in the European debate. So I think that Martina mentioned before a Austrian roundtable on science diplomacy earlier this year, and I think that this type of event should be also promoted in countries where the science diplomacy topic and concepts are still not as developed as in other countries. So I think that this is one of the objectives that we are going to pursue over the next months and within the alliance, but I think that taking the perspective of my organization, of course, this is something that we are going to do also when our co-chairmanship will end, in order to promote this concept and to try to engage as many stakeholders as possible from these countries in the debate, with a particular focus also on the diplomatic community of these countries. Thank you.
I'm just looking around the audience here. Have we a question? Yes, Christina. So can we have a microphone? It's just coming along. So 1, 2, 3, 4 rows up just to the right. Thank you. And can you say who you are, please?
Okay. Hello?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Christiane Diehl from the Leopoldina, the German National Academy of Sciences, responsible for science diplomacy research there. I'm coming back to the title of this exchange, like the next steps for the European framework for science diplomacy. And I'm thinking, I regard all this, also the framework, as a sort of a movement, a momentum, and enthusing the communities that are active here and represented in this room for something where we think we can really strengthen Europe, and that's really can be impactful and really useful for going forward also as societies. But I can see as much effort as we put into making this a really fantastic, impactful movement, it could crash against a coastline of national structures and interests within Europe, European ones. So I'm wondering, whilst we still build up this fantastic thing, this EU science diplomacy, are we already working on softening, as it were, the entrance on the other side? How much are we working, or could we do more work, or is there a strategy for opening the doors of our national structures of science diplomacy?
Thank you. You paint a lovely picture there. Jan, can you respond to that?
Well, ask me again once our council recommendation has gone through the horse trading and council and see what is left afterwards, I would say. No, joke aside, I think of course, it's very normal that, as I said, foreign and security policy is a national sovereign policy, and nations have different interests, also within the EU, definitely. But what we are creating here is actually a sense of unity, a sense that actually in this harsh geopolitical environment in which we are in, we're only going to succeed if we go together as Europeans. If we don't, we cannot afford having 27 member states running in 27 different directions. And that's what we want to try to achieve. That's why it is also important to recognize, of course, that we're all coming from different starting positions. You know, we have member states that have done science diplomacy for many years. France, Spain, they have 15 years of experience with science diplomacy. And there are other member states who are just starting the journey and who are actually learning from each other. And I think this learning from each other is actually a very important part, also to overcome perhaps this national reflex which you might have, so that we see actually there's a benefit, there's an added value if we do this together. It will still not be easy. Let's be very clear about that. And that's precisely the reason why this process with these working groups has been very inclusive. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether Gabriela Papp is still here. She was here earlier at the conference. She's the head of science diplomacy in the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we've deliberately put her as a co-chair of one of the working groups, because we said we need to have all the voices across the European Union on board to actually do it together and come to a joint recommendations we can all live with. And I think, as you say, it has created this momentum, and I think this momentum is a ball that is rolling now, which I hope everybody will go along.
And I guess the challenge is, and I'm just following on from Christian's question, is that there is always negotiation that goes on. But I think one of the prizes that the European Union doesn't grasp is that it doesn't necessarily always sign up to the idea of you have to sometimes give a little to get a lot. And I say that, and this is a personal remark, coming from an ex-member state who now has no negotiating power and is blown around in the wind, just dependent on which international bully wants to push it, because we don't have the friendship and support of the other, in the case of the EU, 27 member states. So I think, you know, there needs to be less complacency and people to wake up to the fact that sometimes you do have to give in order to get that bigger picture. So there's a big prize to be won here. I'd like to take another question from the audience here, if there is one. If not, I'm looking around quickly. Then let me go to one last question then from online. And you might have to help me with the acronym here. How can EU-SD...
The framework for science diplomacy, I guess.
Wonderful, yeah. So my brain's not working quickly enough. So how can the framework, let's put it that way, succeed amidst perceived double standards, including exclusion of EU actors from higher education, from ERC, for example, in Hungary, and limited engagement of non-EU researchers? Any comments, panel? It's a popular question, but we're all mystified by it.
Should we leave it to the diplomat?
Should we? Andrei, what do you think?
No, first of all, I would not say at all that although we are working all here for diplomatic for EU science diplomacy framework, I would not say that science diplomacy along national lines is inherently bad. It has two advantages, at least. One of them, it can mobilize, it's very result-oriented, because, and then it can bring actors together in a very firm and engaging way. This is what national interest does when it is put to work. It has obvious disadvantages, and the most important one is that it does not address common problems. And it is obviously that what we need here is a common action in order to not only in order to face everything that that life throws at us, but in order to be able to compete in the global environment.
Okay, thank you. I'm just mindful of time, so what I want to do now is just to come to each panel member, really no more than a minute, but just reflecting on what you've heard today and the questions, next steps for you all, and I'm going to start at this end. And Martina, what are your concluding thoughts after this discussion? Yeah, just keep...
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think the good thing about those conferences is that you usually get out completely puzzled. You think you know that you know everything, and then after the conference you're like, what? There are 100 new dimensions I haven't even thought about. And it takes some time to actually reflect on them, and then also for yourself to see which are the ones we should tackle first and which we think are most important. The ones I take with me I didn't have on the radar as strong as they were in the conference are those questions of equity, also equity in access to data, for example, when there was the session on ocean. So that was really very profound. Also, the speed with which we have to work when it comes to tech developments, and that actually all the people who work in tech diplomacy think we have to move much faster. So I think we have to also find new tools to speed up. So these are two of the things that were very profound for me and where I think I will put a focus on in reflecting.
Great, thank you. Izaskun.
Thank you. Well, maybe my last reflection would be regarding the framework and the science diplomacy itself. I think somebody mentioned it this morning. Science diplomacy is a tool. And it's for us to decide what for. What for we want European science diplomacy for. And I know that the geopolitical moment is very complicated, but I would like to find a right balance in between idealism and pragmatism in the objectives of the diplomacy strategy that we agree upon.
Okay, thank you. And Andrei.
Yes, my take on the conference that although there are isms, and it started in assessing various fields in a pessimistic way, and there are reasons for it. For example, if you look at different races in disruptive fields, Europe has been we have to admit it, left behind. I was seeing a statement from the SML CEO saying that only 2% of their machines are sent to Europe. Why? Because we are not making chips, and why? Because we are not building enough AI. On this drawback, this conference has given us plenty of reasons for optimism. I mean, we have heard about the constellations of satellites that Europe has. We have visited a beautiful spallation center in Lund. We have discussed about different developments in Eastern Europe, like extreme light infrastructures and so on. So there is room for hope, and this is what the sentiment I think should be after this conference.
Thank you. That was uplifting. So, Alessandro.
Yeah, no, of course I agree with the sentiment of hope. I just want to reflect on one thing. I saw the word cloud before, and the biggest word was equity. I thought that one of the words, but I think I didn't see it, could have been also multilateralism. For me, the success of the science diplomacy framework in the future will be strictly linked to the degree of multilateralism of science diplomacy. So little by little, countries that are placing less importance on a bilateral approach to science diplomacy, the use of soft power, science as a soft power tool, little by little, gradually shifting to a genuine vision of science diplomacy as a multilateral effort. That is my main message. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan Marco.
The most frequent question I'm getting about the European Framework for Science Diplomacy is, how much is this going to cost us? And the answer I'm giving is, just look at what we already have. This enthusiastic science diplomacy community that has emerged in recent years. Look at how many science attaches we have in embassies around the world. look at the fact that half of our member states just in the last 3 years have created in their foreign ministries positions of science advisors, special envoys for science diplomacy, or established science diplomacy units. So actually, we have a lot to offer already. And it's actually an issue of how can we be more strategic, be more synergistic in using all these resources for the public common good, and obviously for our interests as well. I think there's a huge opportunity there, and I see there are countries around the world looking at us, looking at the European Union as a source for inspiration, also in science diplomacy. So I think let's use this momentum and work together, of course, with our partners around the world to turn science diplomacy really in an effective tool that can help to overcome the barriers which we are seeing in the current environment.
Thank you very much. And now we draw to a close at the end of this session, and I guess we're going on to the closing ceremony. So just one comment from me, and it follows on from what Jan Marco was saying. So for the future framework, what we really need is very effective, imaginative and creative coordination, because we have so much resource already. And we don't just have the resource, or indeed part of that resource is the willingness and the enthusiasm of people to get involved and to contribute and to help to shape this. So we need coordination and empowerment of the different actors to be able to deliver something which is really helpful, not just to us in the EU, but also to our global partners. And I would maybe leave with one last thing, is that if you don't like something, or you don't like the world as it is at present, then imagine a future. If you don't imagine the future, you'll never get there. So you need to imagine what you want. And once you have that, that's a precious tool. Then you can go and deliver it. So that's the call to action. And just before we leave, I would like you to join with me in thanking our panel for a most interesting discussion, and also our disruptive speaker for his provocations. Please join me in thanking them.